Introduction, and thanks very much to Core Cities for organising this event, which has already been very useful to me and my team, because as I shall come on to explain, the regional dimension is rather important to us in the last phase of our work, and it's been terrific to have some very well-informed comments from representatives of regional airports, and it's good to see a number of people who've been engaged in this process here, including Jeff Muirhead, who was on the Commission for a while at the beginning of the exercise. This is, for me, being here, there's a sort of double dose of nostalgia. I learnt to my horror that the airport is no longer called Ringway, because it always was, as far as I was concerned. And indeed, it was from Ringway that I took my first ever flight, which was in July 1966. And I got on a Trident and went to Prestwick to pick up an Aeroflot flight to Moscow, which had come from Cuba, I think. And it was on a BA Trident 3. And some of you may have wondered why there is one there. Well, that is actually the plane I was on, and it has been preserved for posterity. But the second reason is that in the late 70s, I was the Treasury official responsible for Concorde, which, of course, as you probably won't astonish you to learn, that the Concorde project was not the Treasury's favourite project, because it just kept on chewing up cash. And after I'd been on this job for a month or so, I was invited to a party in Paris. I thought that was kind of promising. And the French said that the reason for the party was that it was the 10th anniversary. And I said, the 10th anniversary of what? And they said it was the 10th anniversary of the time when the future cost of the Concorde program became $1 billion. So I said, well, what does that mean? They said, well, for the last 10 years, the future cost of the Concorde program has remained at $1 billion, whatever you spend. And the spending has gone up at some years and has gone lower in other years, but the future cost remained exactly the same. Every year it was reprogrammed. They said, we need to spend just $1 more billion in order to complete this. And the French, who had a sense of humour about this, had a party, a big party, to celebrate the 10th year on which the future cost of the Concorde program had been $1 billion, which was one of the more oddest parties I've ever been to. Anyway, this event really is to try to build in the regional dimension to the final report of the Airports Commission. And I'd like to explain sort of where we've got to in the Commission, and particularly how we are thinking about the regional dimension. But I would like to begin with just a couple of perhaps slightly disobliging home truths to this audience, because I've noticed the absence of two things in the debate so far. One is the absence of reference to what the problem that we were given to solve is. We were asked to produce recommendations to maintain the position of the UK as Europe's most important aviation hub. That is the question I have been set. Some of you may think a different question should have been set, but that is the one that was set. So to say, for example, well, maybe we don't need a new runway in the southeast because we can use the hub capacity of the Middle East, that may be true, but it's not the question that I am seeking to answer. So it's not a relevant solution from my point of view. The second thing is that we are operating within a legislated climate change policy. And that has quite a significant influence on the way we have thought about what kind of capacity could be provided and the way in which demand will evolve. We do not know quite how that climate change target would be met. We don't know what will happen to carbon emissions policy generally, whether there'll be an emissions trading scheme or prices will be capped. But At this point, we do know that the UK needs to meet the targets set out in the 2008 Act unless somebody repeals it, and there is no current plan to do that. And that has some implications about the kind of demand forecasts that you look at and the way in which you need to fit aviation capacity into carbon emissions for the economy as a whole. And I'm afraid I always find it slightly disappointing in the debates among airports and airlines that that dimension of the problem is rarely mentioned. But it is significant to us, and I can tell you that it is of significance to a lot of politicians who may well be in crucial positions in relation to this decision after the next election. And if the industry as a whole does not recognise that and situate its arguments within that framework, then I think it's not likely to be successful. So there you are. I start with two home truths of a disobliging kind, but I do feel it's important to get those things on the table. Now, we were also asked in our terms of reference, very clearly, to take a UK-wide perspective on this problem, looking at the national, regional and local implications of any proposals we made. And there's no doubt that the national implications of this are very significant. And I've spent quite a bit of time during the process visiting parts of the country. I've been to Edinburgh and Inverness and Aberdeen and Belfast and Cardiff and other English cities to talk to people about how they see the relationship between their region and London and the South East airport capacity. And we've tried hard, I think, to understand the issues surrounding the connectivity between the UK's regional airports and airports in London and the South East. And today is an important part of that process. So let me just begin by outlining in my words where we are in the Commission's process and then focusing specifically on regional connectivity. We published an interim report last December where we did a number of things. One, we were clear about what we thought the scale of capacity, additional capacity needed was, and we thought one net additional runway by 2030. We also made a number of recommendations for trying to improve the surface access to existing airports. I'll come on to that in a bit later. And we produced a list of what we thought were credible options. As I say, on the assessment of need, we think that the UK definitely needs one net new additional runway in the southeast by 2030, equivalent to handling around 200,000 additional air movements a year. We think that a situation in which we have two airports that are essentially full is not ideal. Overseas people are amazed that we do this, are amazed at how much throughput Gatwick and Heathrow have, given the runway infrastructure they have. But it does create all kinds of issues about resilience, which I think are quite serious. As to where the new capacity should be located, well, right at the beginning, we asked for people to put forward their proposals. We had over 50 proposals put to us for additional capacity. And in some cases, people saying, well, can you not use the regional capacity more effectively to obviate the need for any additional capacity in London and the South East? Now, we looked hard at that. Of course, the tools available for the government to decree the distribution of air traffic around the regions are modest, and Andrew Lobenberg referred in the attempts made in the past, which have not been hugely successful anyway. But we looked at the possibility of differential rates of APD, perhaps via a congestion charge, which we might be able to justify on airports that were already full, and the use of the traffic distribution rules. But in both cases, our analysis showed that options to compel or strongly incentivize airlines to move away from the southeast could weaken the UK's overall connectivity, leading to fewer long-haul connections for the nation as a whole. And redistribution was also found to be less efficient in terms of carbon emissions. You were forcing people to travel further to an airport, and since the propensity to fly is rather greater in London and the South East than the rest of the country, that this was adding journey times and inconvenience for people, but also meaning that you had more flights for the same number of trips, and that was not a good thing at all. So we concluded that while regional airports clearly play a very important role in supporting national connectivity, they would not offer an effective solution to capacity constraints in the South East or for maintaining the UK's status as a global hub for aviation. Once again, I remind you that that is the question that was put to us. So having decided that some new runway capacity in the South East was necessary, we were then tasked with identifying credible locations for it. We had a long list of options, we had SIFT criteria, etc., and we looked at the expansion of regional airports as part of this process. But we did finally conclude that the need for capacity in London and the South East was overwhelming. We looked at how HS2 and other transport improvements and alternatives to flying would change the distribution and the travel patterns of passengers in the future. But in fact, it's not clear that that would make a huge difference. We can expect HS2 to be significant in terms of its impact on overall travel, but the proportion of passengers travelling to an airport on HS2 is not likely to be very large, and the introduction of it does not fundamentally alter the demand pattern. So we, at the end of the shortlisting process, identified Gatwick and Heathrow as credible options for expansion, with two different ways of expanding Heathrow, which we are looking at more detail on. In addition, we undertook to carry out further analysis on the feasibility of an airport in the Inner Thames estuary, and we published some studies on that earlier this year, looking at the cost, the surface access links, etc., and we decided that it did not represent a credible option for shortlisting. That conclusion is not welcomed or shared by the Mayor of London, but then, you can't please everybody all the time. From a regional perspective, I would say that it's important to note that that would have been, I think, an option with some difficulties from a regional perspective. One, it's in the wrong place from a regional point of view. I mean, there's kind of London between almost anyone else and that airport. But also, it did require expenditure on surface access and infrastructure on public expenditure of over £50 billion. And that, I think, is very material in terms of the distribution of infrastructure expenditure in the nation as a whole. I think that applies much less in the case of Gatwick, where the cost is less than £1 billion, we estimate, and in Heathrow about £5 billion. That's, of course, over about 10 years. I think it's hard to say that it would be a serious distortion to overall infrastructure investment decisions over a decade, but I think that the estuary airport undoubtedly would have been. But we have, as I say, from our point of view, we have ruled that out. So since then, we've been looking at the three shortlisted schemes, and we invited the promoters to update their proposals, and one or two people were kind enough to say that the quality of that work has been quite impressive, and the volume of consultation documents that we produced just a couple of weeks ago is quite awe-inspiring. We've tried to summarize the conclusions in an overarching document that sets out the main differentiating factors of the three schemes, and we're hoping to get responses, including from regional stakeholders, to that. So that's where we are, and I shall be chairing a meeting of community groups and local authorities around Heathrow tomorrow, where I shall be wearing body armour, of course. But in parallel, we have been looking at the regional dimension. Now, we all know that domestic services into the London airport system have declined over the last decade, both in terms of numbers of services and frequency. We looked at the trends at Heathrow. The number of connections have declined over a number of years and predicted to fall further. Some of our forecasts say that in the absence of expansion, in 2040 the airport would serve just 4 regional destinations, down from the 7 currently. And as many of you know, there are 16 now served from Schiphol. And these forecast reductions in domestic connectivity to London are troubling, and we decided to look further at them. And to that end, we published a discussion paper in June, which invited submissions and evidence on the question of domestic connectivity, and particularly also on the role that other airports could play in providing capacity before any new capacity could come on stream. And I can't emphasize too strongly that it would be at the earliest by 2025, 26 that a new runway was wheel ready wherever it's chosen to be. And therefore it's absolutely crucial that in the next decade at least, airports like Stansted and the big regional airports, Birmingham and Manchester, do develop their own routes. And so what I've been hearing about the additional long-haul routes in Edinburgh as well is very welcomed from our point of view, because there's no doubt, as somebody said earlier, I can't remember who it was, we did start far too late on this process. And therefore, for quite a long time, regional airports will play a very, very important role. Otherwise, we're going to have a major problem. So we looked at some of the reasons for the reduction of domestic connectivity, with particular focus on the last 5 years or so. We looked at the international connections of regional airports, how that market was shifting, and we asked for people to respond to us on measures which the government has been taking or could take to support regional air services. On domestic services into London, our analysis was broadly supported by respondents. The main reason was identified as being the capacity constraints at Heathrow and Gatwick. But of course, there have been some other factors like APD increases, improved rail services, and the competing merits of other international hubs. I think if rail reduces domestic airline traffic on a point-to-point basis, fine. I don't think that should be an issue for any of us, really. Some of the additional hubs do offer better connections, and I'm not unrealistic to think that anything we do will kind of pull back all the traffic that is now going over the Middle Eastern hubs. But nonetheless, I emphasize that we've been asked to look at the way the UK can develop its aviation better. And so I don't think we can just sit back and say, well, that's fine. Why don't we just use everybody else's runways? Now, the signs are that the number of domestic passengers and services into the capital have stabilised over the last couple of years, and there have been 1 or 2 new daily services established. But the capacity crunch in the southeast will only intensify over the next decade, so there is a risk that the existing regional connections in London could be still further squeezed out of Heathrow and Gatwick. And of course, whilst other southeast airports can continue to act as gateways to the capital, in general, they lack the capacity to transfer passengers onto long-haul international connections, which are important, particularly from a business promotion dimension. We know that it is an important influence on business location, how conveniently people can get, even though businesses internationally recognise that they may have to go through a hub, but they want to be able to feel that they can do that reasonably reliably. Of course, we've also seen the further development, and we've heard about that today, of regional airports' links with international hubs, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Schiphol. One question was raised as to how much we can rely on this. Well, the Middle East, I guess, it looks as though there is going to be additional capacity there. There certainly will be in Istanbul as well. But at Amsterdam is nearing its own planning cap, and therefore I do not think we can look to Amsterdam and say they can expand indefinitely. The environmental issues in the Netherlands are quite significant. Their planning cap is 510,000 ATMs, and when we asked whether there was any chance that that would be increased, the answer was no. So Amsterdam is not an infinitely expandable resource from the point of view of connectivity of our regional airports. Now, we also note the government has committed some funding via the Regional Air Connectivity Fund to safeguard existing routes to London or stimulate links from the UK's smaller regional airports to economic centres, whether domestically or in the rest of the EU. The recent public service obligations to Newquay and Dundee are the first examples of safeguarded routes, and a consultation on providing start-up funding for new routes started recently. And that seems to us to be a sensible response to connectivity pressures faced by regions, particularly perhaps the smaller airports like Newquay or Dundee. Now, the capacity constraints, as I've said, on Heathrow and Gatwick do present an opportunity for other larger UK airports in the coming decade, and here the signs are more encouraging. The analysis shows that most of the UK's largest regional airports either maintained or grew their passenger numbers and route networks, even through the challenging economic period of the recession. If you look more recently, in the first 9 months of this year, passenger numbers have grown quickly at the largest regional airports. 9 of the 10 largest airports grew their passenger numbers over last year, and in 5 of the 6, the growth was of 4% or more. Though it is fair to say that Gatwick, Stansted, Luton and Southend all grew slightly more rapidly than that. Over the same period, these regional airports have developed or strengthened existing services to destinations beyond Europe, and regular services have been announced to New York and Hong Kong, and services to Doha and Delhi are becoming more frequent. And we predict that in future, regional airports will continue to grow their portfolio of long-haul connections, and that the onset of the new generation of more fuel-efficient aircraft will intensify that trend. And as the international connectivity of these airports improve, we expect more regional services to be drawn there as well. It's very important in Manchester particularly that you have a wide range of European connections because that's very important for the city's leading football club. I'm off to Rome next week, of course, where we have an important engagement. That's not of concern to the team from Trafford at the moment. Of course, that sadly they're no longer engaged in that kind of activity. They're more interested in trains to Milton Keynes. But we anticipate, therefore, that a number of the UK's airports will play a crucial role in enhancing or maintaining the UK's connectivity in the coming decade, because there will be no new capacity in London and the South East until the late 2020s anyway. So how best to support these airports is something we also consulted on in our paper. We understand the appetite for improvements to surface access at a number of airports, policies such as linking airports to enterprise zones, creating more effective links between airports and their surrounding authorities and enterprise partnerships also seem to have been effective in a number of places. The rail plans in Manchester could be significant, particularly in improving the proportion of people coming here by public transport. And we made some recommendations on surface access in our interim report, particularly in relation to Stansted. I've got to say, and I think Charlie Cornish referred to this briefly, the government's response to that's been somewhat disappointing, and I think we will make that point ourselves. So we're looking at this area further before we make our final recommendations next summer. But the full potential of the UK's aviation industry and regional connectivity, we think, will best be maximised through expansion at one of our shortlisted sites, with that expansion used in part to develop regional links. As part of our consultation, we've tried to model the likely impact on the regions of expansion or at Heathrow or Gatwick, and Graham Mason referred to that, in fact, in his presentation. And our interpretation of that modelling is embedded in the economic and strategic assessments of each scheme. Our analysis shows that the economic benefit of expansion is likely to be greater, in fact, in the regions than in the southeast. The estimates of this benefit are quite wide, ranging up to over £100 billion across the three shortlisted schemes, depending on which future scenario you consider. But the analysis is based on how the effects will ripple through the UK economy rather than just capturing the immediate local benefits of building the airport or the jobs that are directly at the airport. But there is some economic evidence that suggests that air connectivity is an influence on business generation and business location, and that will have a significant impact on the regions. We're interested in people's comments on this analysis because it's relatively new in the way in which it's been done, but we do think that there is quite a strong case for saying that expansion of capacity in London South East actually has a significant economic impact on the regions. The expansion, we think, is likely to protect and to strengthen the routes into London that currently exist, leading to a rise in the number of passengers on these regional services, and that remains the case right out to 2050, which is as far as we forecast demand. The scheme promoters analysis forecasts a growth in domestic route networks as an outcome of expansion and establishing or re-establishing links to Gatwick or Heathrow from those cities currently not served by these airports could, it seems to us, be beneficial. But that won't necessarily happen on its own, and so I think we do need to look at ways in which that development can be encouraged. So we've asked how these new domestic routes could be secured or incentivised. A number of people continue to make the case the UK could allocate or ring-fence the slots associated with new capacity for domestic routes. That is perhaps slightly problematic in that it might require changes to or new interpretations of the EU slot regulations. I'll be looking very carefully at the UKIP manifesto to see what their policy is on this. But even allowing for a potential change in our relationship with the EU, it seems unlikely that the government or the EU's position on this issue will change dramatically. And even if legal barriers could be overcome, giving priority to certain routes or destinations at a particular airport, of course, has the potential for triggering retaliatory measures. So there are probably some limits to what you can do, but nonetheless, we think finding a way of ensuring the benefits of expansion are felt in the regions is important. And we think we're optimistic that these benefits can be realised. We think that Gatwick and Heathrow and the airlines that serve them will seek to service this demand in the event of expansion, because it would be an important feeder into their broader route networks. In many cases, regional connections would be crucial for the viability of other routes, because most of those passengers would be connected. We would welcome agreements between airports and airlines in this area, and we're very keen to hear what people think about how best we could try to ensure that this additional capacity, if it comes on stream, had a direct benefit to regions. We'll also look at the scope for planning requirements and other measures to ensure regional connectivity in the event of airport expansion, and we're very keen to look at responses on that. Now, we did ask the promoters of the schemes to consider how their proposal could enhance regional connectivity, and as been mentioned, Heathrow promoted this Shipley report, which will also be a useful input to our report. So, in conclusion, we are required to consider how any new aviation capacity affects the whole of the UK, and we think that maintaining and enhancing domestic connectivity is a crucial consideration in the last phase of our work. It's a complicated question because it cuts across many groups in the aviation industry and regulators, local authorities, as well, of course, as looking at alternative transport modes. And so we felt it was important to open it up for debate in the paper that we issued in June, and we have received already a lot of interesting comments to take into account. So, in conclusion, I think that the ultimate acceptability of expansion proposals will in fact depend quite crucially on how we can present them as having been developed in a national context with benefits for parts of the country outside London and the South East. I think without that it will be difficult to generate the needed political consensus in favour of some expansion. So that's why we are attaching a lot of importance to this, why we were very keen to take part in this event today, and why we thank you for the contributions you've made already, and no doubt for those that will be made by Richard Leese and others in the last part of the day. Thank you.